Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am pleased to bring the conversation I had with Fawaz Gerges. Fawaz is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science and a holder of a professorship in contemporary Middle East studies. He has a master's from the London School of Economics and also a doctorate from Oxford University. He's taught at Oxford, Harvard, and Columbia. And his special interests include Islam and the political process, social movements, including mainstream Islamist movements and jihadist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, Arab politics and Muslim politics in the 20th century, international relations in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and many other similar topics. He is well published. He has many books, including the most recent, The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about many of the misconceptions that people in the so-called West have of the Middle East. We talk about the, unfortunately, huge role of colonialism in the region. We talk about Iran and Turkey being exceptions to foreign colonial involvement. We spend time talking about Arab nationalism, which really has as major player of the former president of Egypt, Nasser. We talk about how Arab nationalism during the 40s and 50s and 60s was really a way to try and create some type of united Arab state, if you will, and why that's important and why that has a ripple effect for today. We talk about civilizations and colonialism, and so how this is a historic thing, but also how it kind of comes up to the present. We also talk about political Islam, how Islam has been used by many different political groups and extremist groups, and he's written much about that previously, and many other topics. Of course, this topic is becoming, in different ways, but especially now, it's a very salient topic about the future of the Middle East, the United States and other Western countries' involvement in the Middle East. And it has been there for, at least, post World War I, definitely over the past 50 years, and definitely over the past 25 years, obviously with the wars the United States has had with Afghanistan and Iraq and other misadventures in other places, such as Yemen. But there's a lot of moving parts at the moment in Yemen, in Syria, and of course with Israel and Palestine, which has been ongoing, and very recently with Iran, which has everybody's attention. And so this conversation with Fawaz was very timely. He's quite close to a lot of these topics, has a really, really good voice of trying to find the balance between, what a lot of folks in the Middle East and surrounding areas, what the impressions are, what they want, and kind of some of the U.S.-centered goals as well. And I think at the end of the day, what I believe in and what I think he advocates for, and I think what a lot of people do is people in their local groups and communities, and for better or for worse, in the established nation states, people in their own communities should make decisions about their own ways of doing government, even if we disagree with it. And that's how the world is. And of course, we don't want people to harm other people, but I fully believe in local citizens deciding how they want their governments run and how they want to be represented. We're hopefully seeing some of that in Syria at the moment. We've seen that in other places before. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I do think it is the responsibility of people to elect their own leaders to see what works. And so any meddling from other countries or entities somehow doesn't feel appropriate. So it's going to be something we continue to think about and talk about, and hopefully it can be with some nonviolence. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Please subscribe on the Substack. That always helps. Love to see that. Share with your friends. And now I bring you Fawaz Gerges. I am here with Fawaz Gerges. Fawaz, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for having me. I really look forward to it.
Yes, me too. I absolutely consumed your book. This is the kind of book that we need about an important topic that it seems most people get pretty wrong. So you do such a wide spanning analysis, and it's great. The book is called The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East, out through the always wonderful Princeton University Press. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, why don't you tell listeners just a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, all the relevant details?
Well, my first name is Fawaz, and my last name is Gerges. I am a professor of international relations and Middle Eastern politics at the London School of Economics. The book we're talking about is called The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy, or for freedom and self-determination in the Middle East. And my previous book, which came out 2 years ago by Yale University Press, it was called What Really Went Wrong, the West and the Failure of Democracy in the Middle East. And I think both books, what I try to do in both books is to understand why political change and social progress have been so difficult to achieve in the Middle East, and why the Middle East has reached this seemingly low point in its modern history. How do we understand the social turmoil? How do we understand the political upheaval? How do we understand the prevalence of political authoritarianism? How do we understand the lack of democracy? How do we understand how and why the people struggle in the Middle East in the past 100 years? Why the struggle has been frustrated? What explains the current stalemate and political blockage in the system? And what's the relationship between internal players and external stakeholders?
Yeah, you outline it very nicely. That's definitely how I read the book, and it was very illuminating. And of course, there's lots of history here, which we'll cover some of it. I think all the relevant bits. Let me just ask a general question here, which is, this will kind of set the table for us. The first is, many people in the so-called West, so here in the States, maybe in the United Kingdom or Western Europe, many people have these sort of misconceptions about the Middle East, and they tend to kind of flatten out many groups. They focus on extremism, or they just take a U.S. or Western-centric vantage point. So how do you try generally to say how many of these misconceptions or ways people see the Middle East, you hear people say things like, well, folks over there have always been fighting each other for thousands of years, or, it's always going to have issues, or, all of these things. And again, it tends to generalize and flatten. And I guess how are many of those reductionistic kind of themes not actually accurate to much of the diversity within the Middle East and many of the countries there?
No, I mean, I think you're asking a very substantive question that goes to the very heart of why I and many other scholars spent so many years trying to really examine the complex forces and dynamics, both internal and external, that help us to really illuminate what's happening in the Middle East. I think if there is one word, and I know it's a cliche, it's the question of complexity. We need to understand the complexity behind the struggles that have been taking place in the Middle East. Yet, if you really talk to anyone, whether you're talking about your taxi driver or your bank receptionist or President Donald Trump, you hear very reductionist stereotypes. Donald Trump said they have been killing each other for ages. Medievalism, tribalism, sectarianism. Even the intelligent Barack Obama, who was one of the most brilliant, not only president, but even thinker, Barack Obama reduced the problems in the Middle East to tribalism. He said it's all the fault of tribalism. So in a way, such reductionist explanation really are what I call, they are lazy explanations, because then we don't really, if you say though the Middle East is what the Middle East is, there is an Arab exception, there is a Middle Eastern exception, there is a Muslim exception. You have a rotten gene out there. It's the Arabic legacy, it's the Islamic legacy, it's who they are. They're not really us. Then, we really don't have to think very seriously about the role of the external players. Because the first thing you need to understand, that anyone who really one talks about the Middle East, instead of talking about sectarianism or tribalism or medievalism, even Thomas Friedman at the New York Times, he continuously coined the term, the Middle East is a very dangerous neighborhood. That is, the notion of a dangerous neighborhood, it's unruly, it's violent, it's extremist. It's a dangerous neighborhood but Thomas Friedman does not really tell us why the Middle East is a dangerous neighborhood. What has really made the Middle East a dangerous neighborhood? Could it be that the colonial legacies, how the Middle East was invented by the colonial powers, Britain and France, how borders and frontiers were set up in the Middle East by the colonial powers to promote the imperial imperative? Could it be that somehow how Britain and France colonized the region between 1918 and 1945? They created structural dependencies. They created the ruling elites in many countries. They divided historical Palestine. They created a settler colonial state in the heart of the Arabic and the Islamic world. Can we talk about the war in Gaza or the war in Palestine without talking about the role of the colonial powers, which basically created the problem in the first place? Could really talk about the problems and the stereotypes, sectarianism and tribalism, without talking about the role of the United States from 1945, the end of World War II, till the present. Just to give your viewers your listeners, a quick and a simplistic example. Think of what has happened in Iran in the past 4 decades, the Iranian Revolution, and how the clerics hijacked the Iranian Revolution, and now we call it the Islamic Republic of Iran. How many of you listeners know that it was in August 23, 1953, that the United States of America toppled one of the most democratic leaders in the global South, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh? Because Mohammad Mossadegh dared to nationalize the oil industry. Because Mohammad Mossadegh, the liberal leader of the post-colonial world, did not really bandwagon with the United States in the Cold War. He wanted to pursue a non-alignment. In fact, I made a critical point in my previous book, The West and the Failure of Democracy, What Really Went Wrong. And I said there is a causal link between what the United States did in 1953 by toppling a democratic leader and by replacing the democratic leader, Muhammad Mossadegh, with a dictator, the Shah of Iran, and the Islamic Revolution of 1979, 1980. So instead of saying the Iranians really somehow, the clerics, the extremists, the militants, what really triggered the Iranian Revolution? What was the role of the United States in changing the trajectory of Middle Eastern politics and Iranian politics? I'm not suggesting that we don't need to focus on the local, on the internal dynamics. Of course we have to. In fact, in the book we're talking about, The Great Betrayal, one of my key arguments is that you cannot understand what has happened in the Middle East in the past 70 years without understanding the powerful partnership between local autocrats and Western powers, in particular the United States. That this kind of the unholy alliance between Middle Eastern dictators and American informal imperialism help us to understand a great deal why the people in the region have been betrayed. They have been betrayed by their own dictators, and together with this alliance between Western powers, in particular the United States, and the dictators themselves, because without the important role of the United States, the local dictators could not really do what they have done. I mean, just one simple question to your listeners. Could Israel do what it has done on its own without the preponderant support of the United States? I mean, anyone. So instead of talking about really the Arabs and the Jews killing each other, the Arabs and Jews had not been killing each other for centuries. In fact, they were living in peace before the colonial powers, in relative peace. So neither in Israel nor in the Arab world, those dictators have aligned themselves with the Western powers and even with the Soviet Union and Russia in order to consolidate their rule and to dominate their societies. Final footnote. So instead of really being lazy, mentally lazy, intellectually lazy, I'm talking about stereotypes. The Arabs will always be Arabs, or the Muslims will always be Muslims, or somehow there is something wrong in the gene, in the genetics of Middle Easterners. What I really have tried to do in my books, and in particular in my latest book, The Great Betrayal, and other scholars, is to really dig deeper, dig in, and try to understand the history, the politics, the sociology, and the organic relationship between local structures and external powers.
Yeah, no, it's nicely put. I had a recent conversation with Vali Nasser about Iran, and we talked about 1953, and we talked about 79, of course, and all these things. And so it's absolutely relevant to know some of the more recent history. So I want to talk about one big theme here. Is you're mentioning some of it is for a while in the region you had. The Ottoman Empire, ruled continuously 600 years. Some positive things about it, obviously some negative things about it, of course. And after that dissolves after the end of World War I, we really start to see this sort of rapid evolution of these nation states in the region. So much as you're saying, the British and the French, they start to meddle. They start to draw lines on a map. They start to say, you get this piece, but we're still going to kind of meddle here and all these things, and really does have this impact of imperialism and colonialism. I guess the question I have is from the external kind of interventions or threats, and we see versions of this with the United States later in the 20th century. But at this point, there's one question I want to have. This is sort of a kind of a bigger question, so you can kind of go on about it if you want. Is, yeah, why was that the case? Why did the French and the British after World War I meddle and draw the lines? And, you know, you can talk about the Balfour Declaration if you want. But why was it different for Iran and Turkey? And many people will know about Ataturk, you know, Kemal, and how Turkey went. They went one direction, a secular state, you know, tried to post-Ottoman create, you know, the country of Turkey in some sense. And Iran went a different way. How did these, for much, you know, these other big empires, they really started, you know, with Syria, with Egypt, with, you know, many other places in the Arab states, they create all these things. But Turkey and Iran somehow, it's not completely removed from it, but then it didn't kind of have the same sort of meddling and investment the same way. Talk about, I guess, that theme, or why you think that is with this larger theme of foreign intervention.
Thank you. I mean, I think when we think of the Middle East, for your listeners who are really, you know, don't really have the background, when we think of the Middle East, we're talking about various areas in the Middle East. So you have the Arab states, whether you're talking about the Arab East, Al-Mashriq, or whether you're talking about North Africa, the Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. And you have the non-Arab states. The non-Arab states are Iran and Turkey and Israel. Israel was created by a decision by the United Nations in 1947, 1948. I think a very short answer to your really critical question is that neither Iran nor Turkey was formally colonized. So both Iran and Turkey escaped formal colonization by Britain and France.
Is that because they also have a history of their own empire? We know about the Persian Empire for a long time. We know about the Ottoman, and before them, the Mongols. Big empires. Is that some of the reason you think they escaped that?
To really a large extent, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the Ottoman Empire lasted for almost 600 years. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest empires in the world, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multinational. And the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 after World War I really triggered a major war or battle between modern Turkey and Britain and other colonial powers. And what Turkey did between 1918 and the end of the 1920s was able to really reclaim its independence, was able to really reclaim its sovereignty. Sovereignty is very important, and independence. It fought a war of independence. It won independence. It was able to become, a sovereign nation, a sovereign state. So out of the Ottoman Empire emerged modern Turkey, an independent, sovereign nation, anchored in history, imagined community, civilization. The Persian Empire as well, Iran is a bit different than Turkey because Iran was dominated by both the Soviet Union and Britain, and later on the United States. But also, fortunately for Iran, as a great, as part of a great civilization, was not really formally colonized. It was not really mutilated like the rest of the Arab world. So in my book, when I focus on this chapter of the invention or the creation of the modern Middle East between 1918 and the end of the 1920s, I use a term solidity, that both Turkey and Iran have structural solidity, sovereignty. They have basically their sovereign states, where the Arab world was really most of the Arab world. was created, invented by the colonial powers. It's not just the borders on the frontiers. It's not just about Syria, Greater Lebanon, Iraq. Historical Palestine was divided into the state and the various states. So it's not just borders and frontiers, the political economies, the security structures, the notable, the elite. The colonial powers really not only dominated but engineered those, colonially, we call them colonially constructed state. I mean, Egypt was a great civilization, is a great civilization. Egypt, Egyptians refer to their country in Arabic as Dunya, the mother of the world. And it really is. It's one of the oldest nation state in the world. But what happened in Egypt is that at the end of the 1800s, colonial Britain came in and basically dominated the state because Egypt owed a lot of money to colonial Britain as a result of the Suez Canal. So Egypt really lost its independence and sovereignty as early as the late 19th centuries, long before the early part of the 20th century. So Egypt could have had solidity, and its leaders, its post-colonial, the first generation of Egypt post-colonial leaders, in particular Gamal Abdel Nasser, who came to power in 1952, like Muhammad Mossadegh in Iran. Gamal Abdel Nasser struggled a great deal to create economic sovereignty, because economic sovereignty is really a requirement for political sovereignty. And he tried to really pursue a path of development different than the West. And as a result, the Americans really cut Gamal Abdel Nasser with 1 million cuts. Unlike Mossadegh, they could not really topple him in one stroke, but they basically injured him almost fatally in 1967, because he dared again to pursue an independent role. He was one of the leaders of the non-alignment movement. He did not really bandwagon with the United States when it came to the global struggle for hegemony, supremacy between the Soviet Union and the United States. So again, to come back to your question, your key question, both Iran and Turkey have sociological, cultural, economic solidity, sovereignty. Most of the Arab states lack sovereignty. And if you're not if you don't have sovereignty, you're really not independent. You're not really a fully fledged state. You're a state in the making. So really, when you look at the Arab world, most of the Arab world, including some of the big states, they continue to struggle with the question of legitimacy because they're reliant on external support. I mean, both in terms of national security and also in terms of economic viability. And this really explains the difference between Turkey and Iran on the one hand and the Arab world. Say what have you about Iran. It's not about political disagreement. Regardless of what you think of the clerics in Tehran, think of how much they have been willing to pay in costs in order to be sovereign. Challenging the most powerful nation in the United States. And this by itself, regardless of the politics of it, shows that the significance of sovereignty, as opposed to the Arab state that really have no sovereignty and continue to rely to a large extent on external stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think for listeners, it's important to know, I like your sovereignty piece because that gives a distinction. A lot of people think of anything past, maybe Eastern Europe as just this one region. But Arabs loosely are a collection of people, but they're not Turks and they're not Persians, they're not Iranians, they're all, and they're not Israelis in Israel. So there are important distinctions here. So when you have all these outside interventions, as you were mentioning there, especially in Egypt, you start to have in the 40s and 50s trying to find their own way, many of these Arab states. And so there's a pivot to Arab nationalism. So here, we have you talk about a few structural reasons why there's still some inability to thrive in ways maybe we see other places, such as armed conflicts, the oil market, foreign direct investment, and water security. These are some of the high, problems within the region. I guess what was the answer of trying to turn to Arab nationalism and how it didn't quite work? You can mention, of course, the story of Nasser in Egypt, because he's a big part here. You spent a lot of time in the book about him and try to do this kind of, United Arab Republic at one point, and it didn't work. You can talk about the alignment with Syria. You can talk about the Ba'ath Party. A lot of things to pick up here, so you can go whichever way you want. But Egypt seems a bit centralized at this time for trying to figure out Arab nationalism, and then what happens with Sadat and then Mubarak after that. So yeah, tell us that story about trying to have Arab nationalism as a type of answer.
Well, again, I mean, you're asking really a very big question about why Arab nationalism or why pan-Arab nationalism failed. Because in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, people don't realize that, semi-secular Arab nationalism dominated the landscape. In Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq. The tide was basically in favor of Arab nationalism. Political Islam did not really become a major force till the late 1960s and 70s. And I think we need to break down the notion of pan-Arab nationalism. I think since its establishment in the 1940s, the post-colonial Arab state, whether you're talking about Egypt or Iraq or Syria, I think there has been a dialectical tension between the logic of the nation state, or what we call patriotism, and the logic of the supra-ideological ambition and aspiration of pan-Arab state, pan-Arab nationalism, or Arabism, whatever we call it. So really, since the 1940s, this particular fault line, the state patriotism versus, the collective Arab world. And I think most of the struggles in the 1940s and 50s and 60s revolved around this fault line. The reality is, even Egypt, which was basically Arab nationalism or pan-Arab nationalism, climbed on the shoulders of Egypt as the most powerful Arab state, as the most popular Arab state, as the capital of the cultural production of the Arab state. And Gamal Abdel Nasser used Arab nationalism as a vehicle to really promote Egyptian interests in the region and beyond. But deep at heart, even Gamal Abdel Nasser was more of an Egyptian nationalist than a pan-Arab nationalist. He was not really, his heart was not really in the pan-Arab nationalist project, because he realized, Gamal Abdel Nasser repeatedly said, that the Arab world really was not prepared, was not equipped to really have a unitary Arab state. The United States of the Arab world was not really ready, because there were more differences among the Arab states than similarities. So Gamal Abdel Nasser was even skeptical of the establishment of a unitary Arab state. He believed in the solidarity of the ranks, in coordination, in cooperation. He said, let's really work very hard to bridge the divides among the Arab states. Let's really create the conditions to begin the process of unity and unification. But at the end of the day, Gamal Abdel Nasser, as an Egyptian patriot, used pan-Arab nationalism as a vehicle to really promote Egypt's influence in the region, spread Egypt's influence, and outside the region, to basically extract resources and foreign aid for Egypt. I'm not saying he did not believe in Arab nationalism, he did. but he did not really believe that Arab nationalism or pan-Arab nationalism could lead to a unitary Arab state. So really the establishment of the Egyptian-Syrian Union in 1958 was really more, Gamal Abdel Nasser accepted the union because he had no choice. The Syrian political elite came to him and said, look, we want you to basically govern Syria. We want you to be the leader of Syria. And he was even skeptical of that, but of course, he said, why not? Let's try it. And of course, it failed dismally in 1961 because of the differences, the really structural differences, economic differences, social differences between Egypt and Syria. Two more factors we need to understand about Arab nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism, and why secular pan-Arab nationalism really failed to materialize. I think it was not institutionalized. That Arab nationalism, the idea of Arab nationalism or pan-Arab nationalism or Arabism, really revolved around the charismatic leader of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Hardly any political theories were constructed. No institutions were built in order to really facilitate the project. And I think, in a way, the notion of Arab nationalism or pan-Arab nationalism revolved around Nasserism. There was no daylight between Gamal Abdel Nasser and pan-Arab nationalism. And sadly and tragically, Gamal Abdel Nasser was an autocrat. Gamal Abdel Nasser was not a democrat. In fact, he believed that Egypt and the Arab world were not ready for democracy. Democracy, Gamal Abdel Nasser said, was a luxury that the Arab world could not really afford. So I think this authoritarian, worldview did not really help the project of Arab nationalism, because there were so many Arab nationalism also in the region fighting with each other. It's not just about, most of the fights in the 1940s and 50s and 60s were among variants of Arab nationalism. And finally, and again, as we've said, to really bring complexity, the great powers were deeply opposed to the idea of pan-Arab nationalism or Arabism. The idea of a unitary Arab state threatened the interests of the great powers, whether the Soviet Union or Europe or the United States. In fact, the United States went out of its way to really basically clip the wings of Gamal Abdel Nasser, because the establishment of a pan-Arab unitary state threatened American interests in the region. The various, fragile, semi-sovereign states. And in fact, you cannot really understand the existential battle between Gamal Abdel Nasser and both the United States and the Soviet Union without basically this kind of threats that the great powers perceived Arab nationalism to represent to their interests in the region. And that's why I said, unlike Muhammad Mossadegh in 1953, the United States really was able to cut Gamal Abdel Nasser with a million cuts, or to injure Gamal Abdel Nasser, in particular, as a direct result of the war between Israel and the Arab state in 1967. So in a way, even though the United States and its Western allies succeeded in really undermining Arab nationalism, the ideology that replaced Arab nationalism was really political Islam. So the vacuum left by the defeat of Arab nationalism or the undermining of Arab nationalism was really filled by political Islam. And you cannot understand the emergence and the growth of political Islam in the 1970s and 80s and 1990s without understanding how the United States in particular viewed radical Arab nationalism of the Gamal Abdel Nasser type as part of America's war against radical Arab nationalism godless socialism and communism.
Mm-hmm.
So radical Arab nationalism was viewed through the lens of, radical socialism and godless communism. But this really, in a way, the side effect was, the re-emergence or resurgence of political Islam as the dominant ideology in the region.
Yeah, you're going exactly where I'm headed. Is about religion, the role of Islam. I guess just one follow up, a small footnote here. You tell me how much of it is or isn't relevant. Just real quick. What you're saying about Nasser in Egypt. I guess I think about it. Maybe I don't know how much it is like in the spirit of sorts of folks in many of these countries. But I take a place like Iraq where, the great Babylon, empire and you in much of Mesopotamia has so much rich history. You take, as you mentioned, in Egypt, like you have, thousands of years, literally thousands
Syria.
of years.
Syria
is huge. Damascus,
Lebanon. Again,
Lebanon.
It's one of the oldest.
Yes. Even in places like Amman, Jordan, all these places, they each have so much long history of civilizations of thousands of years, some of the oldest places on the planet. Is it not a bit of a surprise to say that they can't quite, because it's so long and different and they have a lot of pride, and rightfully so, I would too, of that history, that it's hard to kind of coalesce all together around something? Is that not the hard thing when you're talking about a kind of pan-Arab or united Arab? That must be difficult. It's hard to do in the United States. It's hard to do in the United Kingdom. It's hard to do in these places that try to do it. But I have to imagine all of those civilizations and different ethnic groups and all these things has to be difficult, no?
I think just to break down your big question into, in historical terms, what we also need to understand, we cannot talk about the region we're talking about today, the Middle East or the Arab Middle East, without talking about the Ottoman Empire.
Of course.
That for 600 years, most of those Arab states that became Arab states subsequently were really part of the Ottoman Empire. They were ruled and controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Hardly any institutional development, hardly any kind of independent structures. The region itself, the various Arab lands, were basically controlled from, Istanbul. So you're really talking about when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, because he was going to the war between Napoleon and England, and he was trying to really threaten the jewel of the British Empire, India. So he invaded Egypt in 1798. And I think if you read about, the discovery of Egypt in 1798, even though Egypt was normally under the Ottoman Empire, was not formally, but it was very much underdeveloped. It was very much poor. It lacked the resources, the institutions, the political economy. Egypt was impoverished, and most of the regions in the area. So what we need to understand is that when we talk about the Arab world, we're really talking about the post-1918. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Colonial Britain and France and then Italy divided the spoils of the Ottoman Empire between themselves. They created the so-called mandate system to help the people of the region govern themselves, but they really did it in order to serve the imperial imperative. They really dominated the region. They paid lip service to democratization, constitutionalism. They put their own man at the helm of politics. They basically exploited the resources that existed, whether it's in Egypt or Iraq and other places. They played the game of divide and rule. They basically collaborated with minorities. Very important point. Britain and France relied on minorities, whether the Sunnis in Iraq or the Alawites and the Druze in Syria, or whether the Christians in Lebanon, or whether the Copts in Egypt. And this created an extremely dangerous fault line. The perception of majorities, the majorities in the area, that minorities were doing the bidding of the colonial powers. And then even after the end of the formal era of colonialism in 1945, the Middle East, the Greater Middle East, and the Arab Middle East really became a theater in the global Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. That is, the point what I'm trying to say here is that the Arab Middle East or the Greater Middle East has never been left to its own devices. The areas, the lands, and the state, they were created in, the interwar period, 1945, lacked any kind of sociological, economic viability. So that's why when you ask me about, when you talk about before we talk about the great civilization, we need to talk about colonial legacies. We need to talk about structural vulnerabilities. We need to talk about the lack of viable political economies. We need to talk about the fact that the lack of sovereignty. So the states that emerged out of the rubble of World War II were really quite states in progress. They had potential, but they needed to really gain not only sovereignty, legitimacy. And that's why the first generation of post-colonial leaders like Muhammad Mossadegh and Gamal Abdel Nasser, and even the Saudi king, Faisal, they were really I think they got it right. They tried very hard to create organic state. They tried very hard to distance themselves from the external powers, to gain legitimacy at home, to lift millions of people out of poverty, to nationalize economic resources, to really state development, state-centered development, as opposed to opening their fragile economies to global capital, as the United States wanted them to. So what happened as a result of the first generation of post-colonial leaders like Mossadegh in Iran and Nasser in Egypt, they really faced the brunt of the global Cold War. So what civilization? How can we talk about civilization if we can talk about sovereignty or independence? And that's why really, thanks for asking this question. I think because you asked me your first question about stereotypes and about biases and about prejudices, and because people think, look, these people have been fighting each other for. It's not true.
Yeah.
In fact, just let me, and I know this is. Let me just mention one comparative case, because it really gives your listeners a view what we're talking about. People say, when Thomas Friedman says the Middle East is a dangerous neighborhood, when Donald Trump said this is a deadly neighborhood, this is we have to be out of that because it's very dangerous. In fact, as a historian who knows the region a bit and who knows world history a bit, in fact, I would argue that the Middle East is one of the least dangerous neighborhoods in the world. In comparative historical terms, the Middle East is less violent than Europe itself. Think, just to give your listeners what I mean. The European state system emerged in 1648 after the Peace of Westphalia. There was a 30-year war among the German provinces and state. And when the war ended in 1648, devastating war, 1648, a peace treaty was signed called the Peace of Westphalia. And the European state system emerged, the state system as we know it, after the Westphalian Peace was signed in 1648, and that's why we call it the Westphalian state system. I mean, the term.
Yep.
Think about it. It took Europe more than 300 years, 1648 up to 1948, to reach the safe harbor of stability, relative stability, and relative democracy. Think what transpired between 1648 and 1948. The greatest crime in world history, the Holocaust, the greatest crime in world history was committed here, nearby, in the 30s, yesterday, just recent history. And now, think of the backsliding about democracy, whether in Italy or France or Germany or where I am here, or even in the United States itself. So for listeners, and forgive me for being a bit direct, please, when you think of the Middle East, I urge you, I beg you to have some humility, intellectual humility. Because the Middle East is not only, the Middle East is no exception, is not unique to world history. In fact, in comparative historical terms, the Middle East, sadly and tragically, is traveling a similar journey of nation building, of state building, which is soaked in blood. Nation building does not take place in rooms, in conference rooms. It takes place on battlefields. And when you have the great powers intervening consistently in the region, you could explain, now we know why the Middle East is such a, dangerous neighborhood. Because of multiple factors, including external intervention and complicity with local autocrat and settler colonialism in the region.
It's a really wonderful point, and it's part of the reason why I take such an interest in it, and to really try to understand how things work in many of those places. Because the more you know, the more you just see things are more complicated, and I think it's very easy to have, like the Friedman quote you're saying, to just sit on your computer in whatever U.S. city and say all these things about it's a dangerous neighborhood, but when, again, not that you need to be everywhere to know things, but it is complicated. And these folks have long histories there. And as you're pointing out, the recent history of colonialism. It happened all up and down Latin America, too. We've had that in Latin America for a long time. So real quick, one last topic here. We could talk about this for hours, but I guess the big important kind of essential pieces that you want to just bring out is the role of religion and the role of Islam, of course, post 9/11, and many of the things that have happened around the world. But I do want to say, within many of these places in the Middle East, many innocent people are dealing with these interpretive ways of handling and using violence, unfortunately, and they, I think, suffer the most. But yeah, there's a whole long history here. You talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. You talk about Islamists, which I think is an important distinction. I'm glad you raised that in the book. And then, how people use, militant extremism and some terrorism, and they hide behind a religion to do that, or an interpretation of a religion. Yeah, just talk about, I guess, more currently, the role of how people warp the religion of Islam for nefarious intentions sometimes.
Well, it's not, we should not be surprised that you have political groups and you have vested interests, ideologies that use and abuse religion in the service of politics. Think where are the greatest movement of fundamentalism in the world today? Whether you're talking about Christian fundamentalism in the United States, the evangelicals who really want to Christianize the United States, or you're talking about Hindu fundamentalism, or whether you're talking about Islamic fundamentalism. What I'm trying to say is that really fundamentalism, it needs to be understood within the global context. There's really nothing, again, unique about Muslim or Islamic fundamentalism, because I think you have multiple fundamentalism in the world today. So this is point one. We need to understand it comparatively. What does it explain the rise and the growth of religious fundamentalism in the world? What really fuels fundamentalism?
Could I just push a little on that? I agree with you. I will say that around the world and in the region, more often than not, you at least reported or in things that happen, you do see acts of terror or very violent things with in the name of Islam, which I think is inappropriate to do. But I don't see that with, Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or other types of religions like that. And I always wonder why you see that. I agree. Listen, I'm not a fundamentalist. I don't like that stuff of any religion, but it does feel, at least action-wise, a little bit elevated, and I wonder why that is sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I was really planning to explain further.
Oh, okay.
You see, you're right. You're absolutely correct. I mean, we have seen the emergence of a transnational, Salafi jihadist movement, and the Salafi jihadist movement, first by Al-Qaeda Central, then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, and then Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We need to explain that. I mean, there's no doubts about it. I mean, I think, and again, to come back, the context, and I've written quite a few books on the transnational Salafi jihadist movement. My first book on it was called The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global. It was published by Cambridge University Press. And my second book was called The Journey of the Jihadist Inside Muslim Militancy. It was published by Harcourt. And my third book was called The Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda. It was published by Oxford University Press.
You've done a bit of thought on this.
And my fourth book was called ISIS: A History by Princeton University Press. So just I have written really extensively on it. So it's not, and I think, again, context and history. What you and I were talking a minute ago about why Arab nationalism failed, the reasons behind the inability of Arab nationalism to really put its ideas in operation, to create a unitary Arab state. And by the end of the 1960s, Arab nationalism was a shadow of its former self. It was a skeleton. And political Islam emerged as the dominant ideologies, in particular in the 1970s. And in fact, local autocrats, because you mentioned Anwar Sadat, the late President Anwar Sadat, because Anwar Sadat wanted to really build his own legacy. He wanted to distance himself from the legacy of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was bigger than life in Egypt. And so Anwar Sadat flirted with political Islam, used political Islam as a kind of a vehicle in order to basically get rid of the Nasserist tradition. And this kind of the 1970s coincided with the oil revolution in the Gulf, in particular in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So we had your ideas from Egypt about political Islam converged with the oil revolution. And Saudi Arabia was really trying to export its soft power worldwide. And again, what the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan again came in the late 1970s. And what you have now, you have really the rise of political Islam in its many manifestations, mainstream, radical, militant, supported and funded by the oil revolution. And you have the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the US and the Pakistani intelligence services trying to create an army of mujahideen, Islamic fighters, to really basically defeat Soviet communism in Afghanistan. And it was the American National Security Counselor, Brzezinski, who said that, we were willing to align ourselves with the devil, including, militant Islamists, who basically were brought to Afghanistan from all over the world, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, everywhere. The US and Pakistan played a major role in arming, in funding these kind of brigades, global jihadists. And Brzezinski, in his memoirs, if for your own listeners who would read he was fully aware that out of this kind of global struggle against Soviet communism could be basically cost and side effects, collateral damage. So it was really in the valleys and wadis and mountains of Afghanistan that the transnationalist Salafi jihadist movement or global jihadist movement was born. Let's keep in mind that Osama bin Laden, the founder of Al-Qaeda, was in the same trenches as Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, and the United States. In fact, in my books I go out of my way to really show that he was obsessed with socialism and godless communism. To him, communism and socialism were the existential enemy against Islam. It was not the United States. So, of course, again, we need to understand what happened afterwards, after the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan. There was the American invasion intervention in Kuwait in 1991 in order to defeat Saddam Hussein forces and force them out of Kuwait. And then America's deployment of forces in Saudi Arabia. The story is very complex, but I think this is the punchline. You cannot understand the rise of the transnational Salafi jihadist movement or the transnational jihadist movement without understanding the global Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In fact, it was the global Cold War, the struggle for supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union that really brought about, in a way, the rise of this particular movement. First Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then the Islamic State. Because first the United States really fought tooth and nail to defeat secular Arab nationalism. It aligned itself with reactionary Islamist movement in order to against godless socialism and communism. The story is so complex. It's like, even if you say it's a conspiracy, it's difficult. Final point to address your question head on. I think the question of extremism must be taken seriously. So this is not a luxury. We can really, dismiss it. But the reality is the ideology of Salafi jihadism is an ideology really is designed it's a utopian ideology. It's a really Leninist ideology. It wants to restructure the entire state system, which is in its eyes is a Western-dominated system. It's a colonially inspired system, and create a kind of a different vision, a different worldview, based on the first Islamic state in 7th century Arabia. But the big point, what I'm trying is that why the 1990s? It was the heating up of the global Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that enabled tens of thousands of young men to come from many parts of the world and to Afghanistan. Were brought there by various governments and trained by the United States and the Pakistani forces in order to defeat Soviet communism. Once the Soviet communism collapsed, once the Soviet empire collapsed in 1989, then they turned their gaze, they turned their attention against the sole superpower, that's the United States.
Fawaz, there's so many things I want to ask you, so many wonderful topics. So I have to grab you again sometime and have you come on here again and just fully give me download all your wisdom. It's so great. But I know you have a hard stop here, so let's I would say one of the things that I can highly recommend for listeners is your book is fantastic. And I read a lot. I like a lot of things, but really the writing's great and it's very clear, the great Betrayal out through Princeton. And really you go through all of this in really, really clear, precise detail. It's just fabulous. Fawaz, thanks so much for coming on and giving me your knowledge and wisdom. Very, 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 very essential. So big, big, big thanks.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me. And I really think that your questions helped me to tease out many bigger themes than my book really covered. So thanks for having me.